What happens when a CEO visits his own movie theater and hears something that makes him stop cold? Ethan Carter, the CEO of Starlight Cinemas, a popular regional movie theater chain with 15 locations, had spent years building a brand known for its friendly service, clean facilities, and welcoming atmosphere. He believed that going to the movies should feel like a special experience, not just another night, but recently, customer reviews had begun to hint at problems: rude staff, dirty auditoriums, and a cold, uninviting environment. His managers dismissed the complaints as exaggerations, but Ethan wasn't convinced. Determined to see the truth for himself, he went undercover, dressed casually with a baseball cap pulled low. As he strolled through the lobby of one of his busiest theaters, he overheard two teenage girls talking, and what they said made him freeze on the spot. What would you do if you overheard your employees planning to rob your business? Most bosses would immediately call security, but when theater owner Ethan Carter heard two of his most dedicated workers discussing a theft, he froze in his tracks. Instead of confronting them or calling the police, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. The truth behind why these model employees were driven to such desperate measures reveals a shocking reality about workplace culture that affects millions of Americans today. The break room was dimly lit, the hum of a vending machine filling the heavy silence. Ethan stood near the cracked door, mop bucket by his side, frozen in place. His blue janitor's uniform felt unusually stiff against his skin, as if matching the tension in the air. Inside the room, two voices murmured low but urgent. It was Maya and Lila, two employees he had never suspected capable of anything sinister. But their conversation gripped him, unsettling and confusing all at once. "Marcus isn't waiting anymore, Maya. What are we supposed to do?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan tightened his grip on the mop handle. He knew these girls. Maya had been working at the theater for nearly 3 years. She was the one who stayed after every midnight show to clean the sticky floors when no one else wanted to. Lila, though newer, had received glowing reviews from customers for her cheerful attitude. Yet now, here they were, huddling in secret as Maya's strained voice pushed through the woman handling it. Maya said firmly, though a crack in her tone revealed more than she likely intended. "But Tommy's hospital bills, they aren't just going away. And Marcus, he knows about Tommy. I need more time to figure it out." Ethan's mind raced to put the pieces together. Hospital bills, a Marcus. Desperation dripped from every word, and though the details were unclear, it was obvious they weren't discussing something minor. He thought back to the countless times Maya had smiled through long shifts, or how Lila always stepped in for coworkers without complaint. Why would two such dedicated employees feel cornered enough to hatch whatever plan this seemed to be? He leaned in slightly, careful not to make the bucket wheels squeak, straining to hear more. Maya dropped her voice lower, almost too faint to catch. "It's just the money in the safe. A few thousand, maybe. We're the last ones here, Lila. Nobody will even know it's us." Ethan's stomach sank. The safe. She was talking about the one in their manager's office. A small, dented metal box in the cabinet behind Rick's desk. Suddenly, everything about this confrontation felt surreal. He could hardly process what he was hearing. These weren't strangers plotting a crime in some far-off context. These were his employees. People he'd assumed shared the same values he'd built his company around. Lila hesitated before responding, and a quiet sniffle gave her away. "I don't know, Maya. What if we get caught? This isn't who we are." Maya's response was sharp but filled with exhaustion. "Then tell me another way to pay 10 months' worth of medical bills, while someone like Marcus is breathing down your back, Lila. Tell me how Tommy gets the medicine he needs to even survive the year." "I'm out of answers." 1,000 scenarios flashed through Ethan's mind. He could storm in there right now, demand they call it off, and let the chips fall where they may. He could even quietly dial security from his back pocket and have someone else deal with it. Those options, however straightforward, felt impossibly shallow. He wouldn't be helping anyone by reacting on impulse. Something in their voices, the crackling tension, The sheer desperation made him pause. His past floated hazily to the surface. Not long after college, Ethan had found himself drowning in debt after his mother's unexpected health crisis left their family grappling with financial ruin. He had spent years clawing his way out, working nights while sleeping in his car some days. It was a chapter of life he thought long buried, but listening to Maya and Lila now, it was like staring into a mirror of his own struggle. He rubbed a tired hand over his face, caught between the need for justice and an uncomfortable compassion stirring in his chest. The thought of employees stealing under his watch should have sparked anger or even betrayal. Instead, he felt the weight of their choices and understood the corners they must have been pushed. Marcus. Who was Marcus? And what sort of pressure was he laying on Maya that made her edge closer to this dangerous line? Ethan clenched his jaw, cataloging every detail. He heard enough to know Maya mentioned Tommy, her younger brother, and the insurmountable cost of keeping him alive. It painted a grim but incomplete picture. Between the loan shark and the mounting medical expenses, Ethan saw two people desperately trying and failing to stay afloat. Stepping away from the door, he gripped the mop bucket tighter and turned the corner into the hallway. His face remained neutral, but inside his thoughts brewed in a violent storm. Maya's last words, "It's just the money in the safe," replayed in his mind. It didn't sound like someone greedy or opportunistic. It sounded like survival, plain and simple. Still, sympathy didn't mean tacit approval. What they were planning could damage their lives irreparably. At the same time, rushing into punitive action felt just as reckless. He made up his mind before he even returned the mop cart to the closet. As tempting as it was to walk into Rick's office and dig further into what Maya and Lila might have access to, he stopped himself. Forcing their hands now wouldn't solve anything. Ethan had spent years as a leader, and if there was one lesson he'd learned, it was to park assumptions at the door until you had all the facts. His next move would require patience and restraint. He needed to look deeper, not just into Maya and Lila's situation, but into the entire theater. What other struggles might the staff be going through under Rick's management? Ethan couldn't ignore the way employees stiffened when Rick entered a room, or the recurring reports of sudden hour cuts that had crossed his desk. The break room conversation had planted more questions than answers, but for the first time, it felt like a doorway to understanding the broader culture he'd failed to investigate. Staring at his calloused hands for a moment, Ethan let out a breath. He hadn't gripped a mop in years, yet here he was, grappling with something far heavier than a bucket of water. Maya's voice still echoed faintly in his ears, not just in desperation but in pain. He had a duty to respond, but the question of how loomed large. Ethan turned back towards the break room, if only for a fleeting glance. He caught just the edges of their hunched silhouettes through the narrow glass pane on the door. Lila had her head buried in her hands, while Maya sat rigid, likely bracing for whatever their decision they'd already convinced themselves they had no choice. That was when Ethan decided no one would be fired. No one would be hurt by rash judgment either. This wasn't the moment to play the disciplinary CEO or the moralistic teacher. It was time to understand the roots of what went wrong, not just in Maya's life but in his company as well. He didn't need to stop at blaming the girl's circumstances. He needed to look higher within their organization. Resolving this comprehensively would mean unraveling why, under his watch, these employees had been left to flounder so hopelessly. He didn't want to admit what was nagging at the back of his mind, but he couldn't shake it. Part of this, the desperation, the lack of real support for people like Maya and Lila, was his responsibility. The system he believed in trusting had cracks. Maybe they weren't deliberate, but they had been big enough to let two loyal workers fall through. Ethan's grip on the mop handle tightened in a silent acknowledgement of the direction he'd chosen. Empathy, no matter how inconvenient or messy, was the only path forward. He had vowed to build a company that valued people, and that value had to mean something now when it was hardest to show. As he wheeled the mop bucket out of sight, he knew his actions would need to account for not just individuals but systemic failures. from toxic leadership to unchecked suffering. For now, he would let Maya and Lila believe their secret remained safe. He had no intention of leaving them to their own devices indefinitely, but this decision wasn't just theirs anymore, it was his too. He needed to learn their story on their terms, not thrust justice or misguided punishment upon them without fully understanding what was at stake. Ethan didn't act on impulse after overhearing Maya and Lila's hushed conversation. Instead, he kept his head down and used the role of janitor to quietly observe them over the next week. It wasn't difficult to notice the cracks in their composure once he started looking. Maya, who once moved through her shifts with careful precision, now seemed harried and distracted, her phone frequently in her hand as she darted into corners to take whispered calls, and kept her eyes on the crowd. Lila, meanwhile, wasn't her usual self either. The once bubbly employee who thrived on chatting with guests at the concession stand now barely looked up from the register, her hands fidgeting as she struggled to wrap orders quickly enough. One night, Ethan passed Maya in the hall on her way to the storage room. There was something off about the way her face was pulled tight, as though she'd spent the last few hours holding her breath. She paused at the door and fumbled with her keys, taking a long, shaky breath before forcing herself to step inside. That level of stress wasn't normal, not for a midweek shift at a theater that wasn't even particularly busy. It was in the moments of eavesdropped conversations or small observations that the pieces started to fall into place. Ethan overheard Maya late one evening on a phone call by the back exit while she thought the lobby was empty. Her voice was muffled yet frantic. "I told you I'd have it by the end of the week. Just stop calling here, okay? I'll figure it out." There was a pause, followed by a quieter, almost broken tone. "I don't have anything left to give you right now." Conference calls with corporate or overseeing budgets had nothing on this kind of problem solving. For Ethan, this was personal. Listening to her, he felt his chest tighten with an old, familiar ache. This wasn't the sound of someone making excuses or stalling for time. It was survival, plain and simple. Someone doing everything in their power while grasping at frayed edges. It reminded Ethan of nights when he'd stayed up late, balancing which overdue bill to pay first, when the dented can of soup in the pantry made him grateful at least for something he could eat. What clarified matters further came from one of Maya's breaks. While seated by herself in the corner booth of the employee lounge, Ethan caught sight of her scrolling through photos on her cracked phone screen. He noticed one initially lingered longer, a boy no older than 11 or 12, smiling in spite of what was clearly a hospital gown draped over his thin frame. His head was freshly shaven, his pale complexion standing out even through the poor resolution of the outdated phone. This, Ethan assumed correctly, was Tommy, the root of it all. Pieces of earlier conversations came back now with clarity. Hospital bills, medicine, and the overwhelming weight Maya carried silently each day. But this story was more tangled than simply medical debt. Maya wasn't just buried under legitimate expenses. She was running out of time. The shadow looming over her wasn't the hospital, it was Marcus. For every Marcus Ethan had read about in the news or seen depicted in movies, there were countless, undisclosed predatory lenders preying on people like Maya. Everything about her visible stress screamed wasn't just monthly reconciliation calls she was dodging. It was something heavier and far more immediate than that, even if she was trying desperately to act like she could stay in control. Maya had borrowed from a loan shark, no doubt out of desperation when other options failed her. What started as a lifeline quickly became her sinking anchor. If there had been a moment early on when Marcus's money bought her another week or another crucial surgery for Tommy, that moment was long gone now. All that was left were threats. And those threats were the kind that reached further than just her bank account. They informed every rushed step she took, every fumbling conversation, every frantic call Ethan overheard. Lila's anxiety made more sense once Marcus was part of the equation. Ethan noticed her flinch each time customers raised their voices, even mildly, or when the theater manager Rick stopped by to bark condescending orders at her during shifts. Whatever she had promised Maya, the fear of being caught wasn't just theoretical anymore. It had settled somewhere under her skin, just visible enough on the surface if you knew where to look. Lila was scared. Scared of stealing, of getting caught, but equally scared of what might happen to Maya if they didn't follow through with whatever it was supposed to be. Ethan remembered his own crossroads years ago, a time when making one wrong choice would have crushed the fragile balance he'd finally built. His family couldn't even afford a hospital stay when his mother was sick. He had barely managed to secure the funds for less urgent treatments, though the sacrifices it took to get there nearly broke him. Sitting in the dark theater lobby one night after everyone else left, all of it came rushing back. It was impossible to look at Maya's tired hands, her trembling voice, and not feel the same frantic impossibility echoing from his memories. "She's drowning," Ethan mouthed quietly to himself, watching Maya across the threshold of the employee break room another day. The image was painfully vivid in his mind, a torrent of currents pulling her under while she fought to stay afloat. Not because she'd made foolish decisions, but because the world around her had conspired against her. Because a system built to help was strangling her instead. Ethan could see it now. Maya scrambling for breath as the water pulled harder, and Lila holding her hand in a desperate attempt not to let go even though she, too, teetered toward the edge of being overcome. Ethan adjusted his thinking after that realization. He hadn't just stumbled onto a personal crisis for two employees. This wasn't about catching a thief or preventing one from materializing. It was about the water itself, those waves that were quietly rising around people like Maya and Layla, and quite possibly others under his employ, just waiting for their lives to capsize. This undercurrent of desperation wasn't born in isolation. Ethan just hadn't been paying enough attention until now to notice the signs. Were everywhere. Maya was tied to Marcus, yes, but wasn't it also the fault of the industry's inability to pay a living wage? Rising healthcare costs. A manager like Rick, who seemed more concerned with keeping the higher-ups off his back than addressing the conditions his employees worked under day after day. Ethan hated what those realizations stirred inside him. They pressed on the corners of his guilt. Whatever culture might exist in his movie theaters, he couldn't deny now that it bore his fingerprints on some level. He had built this chain. He set the tone, and whether it was done consciously or through negligence, he let cracks form, big enough to let Maya and Leela fall through. For the first time since donning his disguise as a janitor, Ethan felt like he was seeing the truth, albeit in fragmented pieces. He didn't know exactly how many of his employees might also be barely holding on, shadowed by similar personal struggles, but he knew this wasn't as uncommon as he'd wish it were. Maya and Lila's situation was uniquely shaped by their circumstances, yet the broader themes were painfully familiar to anyone who'd read the news. Rising medical expenses, unchecked financial predators, and workplaces that churned people toward burnout rather than lifting them up. Ethan felt the choice solidifying under him as he made his way back to the supply closet to shelve the mop for the night. Yes, there was a crisis concerning Maya and Layla. Yes, it carried urgency, but the answers wouldn't end there. Ethan knew what he had to do next. Before addressing anything on the surface, Ethan vowed to investigate what sort of conditions Rick had been fostering under his leadership, whether intentionally or through indifference. He was adamant now that understanding their behavior wasn't just a matter of dissecting it piecemeal. He needed to see the bigger picture and make sure there weren't more employees similarly drowning in silence. Ethan stood in the quiet office, tugging the borrowed janitor jacket straight, as if it might help straighten his thoughts. The break room conversation with Maya and Lila still echoed sharply in his mind, but a new question had emerged from it. How did it get this bad without him noticing? Maya's desperation wasn't just the result of bad luck or personal circumstances. There were cracks beneath the surface, ones that allowed this kind of desperation to take hold. And if he was going to do anything to help, he needed to understand those cracks. The focus shifted to Rick Carter, the theater manager. Rick had worked at this location for 6 years, the same length of time it had been open. On paper, he was the model of efficiency. His reports showed consistently low operating costs and minimized employee turnover. He even earned a few awards from corporate plaques that still hung proudly on the break room wall next to faded staff schedules. But the more Ethan lingered in the theater disguised as a janitor, the less convinced he became that those reports lined up with reality. The first clue was how employees responded to Rick. Whenever he walked into a room, conversation stopped. People darted away, eyes glued to their shoes, mumbling excuses about needing to get back to work. If he gave a booming order, employees snapped into action, though not with the energy of workers motivated by respect. They moved like people who'd been threatened. It was subtle enough that a passing customer or even a quick visit by upper management might miss it. Staying nearby as an unseen observer, Ethan saw it play out again and again. By the time Rick entered the concession stand for his usual end-of-shift check-in, the awkward tension among the employees was undeniable. Ethan hovered nearby, restocking napkins, ears tuned to catch every word. "This garbage needs to move faster," Rick barked, pointing at a popcorn machine with grease-streaked fingerprints smudged against the glass. "I don't want to see anyone sitting around when that much cleaning still needs doing." No one argued or asked questions. They just nodded, shoulders sinking slightly as though the weight of another demand had physically pressed down on them. Ethan caught the faint flash of eye contact as one employee behind the counter gave another a knowing but tired look, like they were in silent agreement it would be easier to just push through and avoid Rick entirely. At the start of his undercover assignment, Ethan might have written this behavior off as strict, but not necessarily abusive. Management now, after days of overhearing staff whispering discontent to each other in private corners, a darker pattern began to take shape. When he dug deeper into Rick's practices, more disturbing details bubbled to the surface. Rick was thriving under a facade of efficiency, but his success came at the expense of everything else. Employees weren't being paid fairly. Ethan found multiple instances of Rick shaving hours off payroll sheets before submitting them, effectively pocketing a few extra dollars from labor costs. Wage theft wasn't just unethical, it was illegal, and yet it had become routine under Rick's watch. Talking to staff confirmed this wasn't some isolated error. One quiet-voiced usher muttered that Rick told them budget cuts were forcing him to make tough calls, but Ethan noticed those cuts never seemed to apply to Rick's quarterly bonuses. The financial mistreatment was bad enough, but that wasn't where Rick's behavior ended. Employees spoke about verbal outbursts laced with belittling remarks. "Are you seriously this stupid?" he had reportedly shouted at a new hire just days before Ethan's arrival. Ethan recalled seeing that very same worker later, nervously inventorying a soda fountain while avoiding interaction with customers entirely. The atmosphere Rick created went deeper than a bad mood or occasional temper. It was seeping into the morale of even his strongest employees, including Maya and Lila. Safety concerns were equally ignored. A camera in the hallway behind the theater's rear exit had been broken for months, leaving a blind spot where employees could feel vulnerable late at night. Ethan overheard one assistant manager note this during a shift briefing, only for Rick to shrug it off. "If corporate wants to cover upgrades, let them pay for it," he replied dismissively. What Rick didn't acknowledge, and perhaps didn't care to, was that decisions like these left employees like Maya and Lila exposed not just to work stress, but unsafe conditions. Rick's unchecked control went so far that Ethan discovered falsified reports submitted to corporate. Employee complaints disappeared from feedback surveys. Requests for more hours or better schedules were buried. By tailing data, Rick painted a picture of a well-managed theater. In doing so, he avoided scrutiny while pushing employees like Maya closer to breaking points. It was an entire illusion curated just to keep himself untouchable, no matter the cost to anyone else. The deeper Ethan looked, the darker the picture became. Rick had even created something Ethan could only describe as an unofficial blacklist. He kept records names of employees who had spoken up, filed HR complaints, or challenged his decisions in any capacity. Those names then quietly found their way onto schedules with reduced hours, or in the case of past hires, no hours at all. It explained the fear evident in every sideways glance employees gave Rick when they thought he wasn't watching. Beneath his polished exterior as a seasoned manager was a destructive aversion to accountability. It was a revelation that left Ethan grappling with guilt. He had selected Rick for this leadership role himself, impressed by his resume and apparent knack for staying within budget. He had even approved some of Rick's glowing performance reports without looking further because, at the time, the numbers had looked good. Yet here was the result: a theater chain with cracks on every level, widening with every ignored complaint or buried concern. Ethan sat in a storage room late that evening, staring at a clipboard full of inventory lists he wasn't actually reading. The weight of his missteps felt heavier than the mop bucket he'd been pushing all week. By trusting management to handle itself without oversight, he'd allowed a culture of fear and exploitation to fester right under his nose. Employees like Maya and Layla weren't just collateral damage. They were victims trapped in a system he had unknowingly enabled. Through the mess of emotions swirling in his head, anger at Rick, shock at the scale of the issue, disappointment in himself, one thought became crystal clear. Leadership wasn't about making the numbers look good for boardrooms and shareholders. It was about the people who worked at the ground level, the ones who kept the business running every day. Protecting them and ensuring their voices mattered was the only way forward. The more Ethan pieced together Rick's involvement, the more everything about Maya and Lila's desperation became painfully logical. They weren't naturally dishonest or criminally inclined. They were stuck, pushed toward breaking points by financial theft, toxic leadership, and a system that ignored their humanity in favor of cost efficiency. Rick's refusal to protect his workers didn't just make him a bad manager, it made him the direct cause of their suffering. Ethan knew there wouldn't be a simple fix. Firing Rick could solve some immediate problems, but it wouldn't undo the damage or address the broader issues within the company culture. To ensure employees like Maya and Lila got the support they needed, systemic change had to follow. Better wages, fairer management practices, and a more accountable leadership structure weren't just big concepts for a corporate meeting. They were now priorities that could define the company's future. With these thoughts heavy in his mind, Ethan stepped back onto the theater floor. His movements were steady, but his purpose had shifted. Rick Carter would be confronted, but the confrontation was just the beginning. Turning things around wouldn't mean patching cracks at windows. It would mean rebuilding the foundation entirely. Ethan sat across from Maya and Lila in a small, windowless side office that felt even smaller with the weight of what was about to happen. The girls were clearly out of their depth, Maya's arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together, Lila fiddling with the edge of her uniform's apron, staring hard at the floor. They looked like kids bracing themselves for a punishment they couldn't avoid. Ethan let the silence stretch, giving them a chance to speak first, but neither of them said a word. Finally, he broke it. "I know about the plan," Ethan said quietly. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it was firm enough to make both women flinch slightly. "I heard you in the break room." Lila looked up sharply, eyes wide, fear written all over her face. Maya's reaction was different. Her shoulders stiffened, lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she sat as still as a statue, like someone preparing for the worst. "Are you going to fire us?" Lila's voice cracked as she spoke, her hands clutching the fabric of her apron even tighter now. "Please, nothing's happened yet. We didn't actually do anything." Ethan shook his head slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back, watching both of them. It wasn't anger that filled him, though it was something harder to define, something heavier. Against his better judgment, he found himself remembering the scared, helpless feeling of sitting across from creditors himself when he couldn't make a payment. He couldn't help but see that same desperation sitting in front of him now, painted on Maya's pale face and Lila's trembling hands. "I need you two to tell me everything," Ethan said finally, keeping his voice level. It wasn't about scaring them into confession he needed to understand. He had already decided he wasn't involving the police, but if he wanted to fix this, their stories were essential. Maya forced a shaky breath and finally spoke. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she started, staring down at the table as she talked. Her voice was clipped, raw from holding back. Tommy's my little brother. He's 11. Her words slowed, her hands moving to her lap as she gripped her knees briefly before continuing. "He's fighting leukemia, and the treatments, they're expensive." She pushed out a pained laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all and swiped at the corner of her eye before anything fell. "Come and go. Medical bills," Maya continued, finding her pace now, "stack up faster than you expect. Maybe I was naive thinking I could handle it, but rent doesn't stop just because there's hospital debt, and food doesn't get cheaper just because you're struggling. You do what you can, right?" She gestured vaguely, as though willing him to agree. "But Marcus, I borrowed from him thinking it'd be smart. Something short-term, you know, a little more time to breathe." A hollow sarcasm crept into her voice. "Turns out Marcus doesn't really like waiting for his money." Ethan exhaled through his nose but stayed silent, giving her space to continue. Lila's fingers tightened against the chair's edge beside her, as if she were bracing herself for the next part. Maya's voice dipped lower as she added, "He knows where I live, and he knows about Tommy." The tightening in Ethan's chest grew sharper. Lila finally spoke up, barely above a whisper. "She didn't tell me she'd borrow from someone like Marcus until recently. When I found out, I didn't want her to do this alone. I thought maybe—" She stopped suddenly, pressing her lips closed. Ethan watched as she swallowed hard and added, "I swear this wasn't about wanting to steal. We just didn't know what else." Her voice faded before she could finish the thought. But Ethan understood what she was trying to say. He had heard enough. Their actions weren't born from some grand scheme or selfish motive. They were clawing at a solution to something so much larger than themselves. His stomach turned with the weight of it, the reality sinking in deeper. If everything they were saying about Marcus, about the hospital bills, was true, they weren't the problem at all. They thought back to days when he'd had to choose between paying rent or keeping a fridge stocked with something other than water and leftover coffee. He remembered the directionless anger that came from knowing hard work sometimes wasn't enough no matter how much effort you gave. It wasn't that he excused what Maya and Lila had planned to do, it was that he understood how someone could get there. The company's policy was clear. Theft or the attempt of it meant termination, often followed by involving law enforcement. But Ethan couldn't bring himself to default to company rules this time. Something about it felt off, almost hollow, considering what he'd seen and heard these past few days. He thought of Rick Carter falsifying payroll sheets to shave hours, of the employees too afraid to even look up when he walked by. The deeper problem wasn't these two young women, it was the toxic environment that had pushed people like them this far. Ethan leaned forward now, hands on the table. The pause hung heavy in the room before he finally spoke. "I'm not going to fire you," he said quietly, watching their faces jerk up in unison. Maya blinked as though mishearing him, and Lila's mouth dropped open slightly. "What?" Lila stammered. "You're not—" Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, I'm not calling the police either." The silence that followed was stunned, but Ethan didn't give them time to linger in it. He pressed forward. "What I overheard, it told me enough to know you're not bad people. You're two people trying to survive something that feels impossible, and you need help, not more punishment." Maya stared for a moment, her hands frozen mid-gesture on the table. Then, suddenly, she looked away to one side, blinking hard and biting her lip, as though her body didn't trust the relief. Lila remained wide-eyed, but for the first time that night the tears welling up weren't from terror. Ethan straightened in his seat, letting his voice settle into something steadier now. "I'm going to help you find a way out of this," he said, keeping eye contact with Maya specifically this time. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy. But there's a better solution than what you felt forced to do. Right? If Maya's voice caught mid-sentence, but she cleared it and tried again. What if other people find out about this? Ethan gave a brief nod, acknowledging the hurdle. I've thought about that, he admitted. People will talk. Some of them might think me helping you means I'm showing favoritism or going soft. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Behind the calm explanation, Ethan felt the weight of the stakes. He knew that sparing Maya and Lila from punishment wouldn't be popular with everyone. Employees would share their side of the story, likely twisting it into something unrecognizable by the end. By helping two employees who had almost crossed a serious line, he would have to prove to the rest of his staff. More than that, he would have to use this opportunity to display a broader cultural shift, one that had already started forming in his mind. I believe in second chances, Ethan said plainly. His expression softened, though his voice remained firm. But don't misunderstand me. This isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about dealing with it the right way. Maya met his gaze then and finally opened her mouth to speak. I don't know what to say, she began, her voice cracking slightly. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. You can thank me by trusting me, he replied simply. Trust that I mean it when I say I'm going to help. Neither woman had any reply for that, but the relief in their body language said enough. Quietly, Ethan stood, signaling the conversation was over for now. For the moment, I need time to figure out how we handle this going forward, logistically and otherwise. But for now, you're both safe. Go home and don't worry about tomorrow for once. As he watched them leave the office, still visibly shaken but carrying less weight than when they had walked in, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't just saving two employees from a mistake. They were the start of something much bigger. Something that might just save the rest of the company, too. Ethan walked into Rick Carter's office late in the afternoon. The blinds over the windows were drawn halfway, leaving the room dim except for the harsh light from a desk lamp illuminating an assortment of scattered papers. Rick looked up from the monitor, his usual air of casual authority settling into place when he realized who had entered. But Ethan wasn't dressed in his janitor's disguise this time. Standing in a plain button-down shirt and jeans, his expression was hard to read, but his posture said everything Rick needed to know. This won't take long, Ethan said, leaning against the doorframe. Rick tilted his head slightly, pretending confusion, but there was unease behind his eyes. He likely knew his behavior was under more scrutiny than ever, and rightly so. Ethan went straight to the point. He laid out what he'd discovered, the missing hours on payroll, the reports altered to hide employee complaints, the pervasive fear Rick had instilled in his team. Rick tried to protest, stammering arguments about budget constraints and demanding metrics from corporate, but his excuses crumbled under Ethan's calm, precise words. When Ethan finally delivered the news that Rick's employment was terminated effective immediately, the room fell completely silent. Rick didn't say much after that. He simply pushed his chair back, gave a half-hearted shrug under the guise of acceptance, and began clearing his desk. Ethan watched him go, expression unchanging, not out of malice, but because this moment wasn't about Rick. It was far bigger than one person. Firing Rick was necessary, but it wasn't the resolution Ethan was looking for. It was only step one. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the theater early, clipboard in hand, ready to outline the changes that would soon redefine everything about how the Grand Plaza Cinema operated. Over the following weeks, the first steps toward rebuilding began. Ethan introduced a policy that would ensure every employee received a living wage, enough to cover basic needs without having to rely on second or third jobs just to get by. It wasn't the kind of announcement that came with fireworks, but Ethan noticed the subtle shifts among his employees, the murmurs of surprise, the small sighs of relief cutting through the usual chatter. Health insurance followed soon after. But this wasn't the standard plan, with a long eligibility waiting period that excluded more part-time workers than it helped. Ethan encouraged his team to design a plan that took effect immediately for all employees and covered more than the bare minimum. For employees like Maya, who had watched helplessly as her brother's medical bills piled up, this wasn't just a company perk, it was a lifeline. Another key change involved flexibility. Schedules had been a frequent source of quiet resentment under Rick's leadership, with employees often left scrambling to cover last-minute changes or struggling to earn enough hours. Ethan replaced the rigid, unpredictable scheduling system with one that accounted for family needs, emergencies, and the variation in his employees' unique circumstances. No one would have to choose between being there for their loved ones and keeping their job. But perhaps the centerpiece of this overhaul was the anonymous feedback system Ethan rolled out across the organization. A sturdy metal suggestion box mounted in the break room might not have looked revolutionary, but Ethan made its purpose clear. It was there for employees to speak their minds, to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. He promised his workers that their feedback wouldn't just fall into a void. It would be read, it would inform decisions, and it would matter. Maya and Lila's role in this transformation didn't go unnoticed. Ethan made sure they weren't just forgotten figures in the theater's daily operations. Instead of keeping them stuck in the same roles, he gave them opportunities to grow within the company. Maya became a shift leader, responsible for overseeing operations during pivotal times of the day, proving her ability to manage others even under pressure. Lila, who had always been eager to learn, trained under the projection team to take on a more technical role, ensuring screens ran smoothly without interruptions. Both women responded to these chances with dedication and a cautious optimism that grew stronger over time. As more of these changes began to take root, something unexpected happened. It started small, a thank you from one of the ushers in the hallway, an extra smile at the concessions counter. Then it grew. Employees who had once been hesitant to speak up began offering ideas, not just complaints. Workplace morale shifted like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Even the regular customers seemed to feel it. The theater began to reflect the vision Ethan had originally dreamed of, where employees worked with pride and visitors felt welcomed by people who genuinely cared. Patient data backed up these observations. An audit conducted by third-party reviewers showed an almost 40% increase in customer satisfaction scores over a span of several months. Ethan used this information to make further improvements. Bolstering an employee's wasn't just morally sound, it was good business. These results weren't limited to his single theater location. Word spread quickly within the larger company chain. Soon managers from 3 other locations reached out, asking to implement the same training programs and workplace policies that had sparked such tangible change at the Grand Plaza Cinema. But the most profound moment for Ethan came quietly in the form of a single exchange. It was late one evening after closing, the theater empty except for a few employees finishing their rounds. Maya approached him hesitantly near the usher's station. Her face lacked the stress lines he'd noticed the first time he saw her, replaced now with an unfamiliar lightness. She reached out to pass him a folded piece of paper. "Hatch this?" Ethan asked, his tone easy but curious. "Tommy drew it," Maya replied softly. Her brother's name alone carried an undertone of emotion that settled heavily in the quiet hallway. Ethan unfolded the paper, revealing a crude but charming crayon drawing of a movie screen, surrounded by stick figures, a family. Maya cleared her throat. "This doesn't fix everything we've been through," she began, her voice faltering slightly before steadying herself. "But you saved my family when no one else would. I don't think I'll ever forget that." Her words hung in the air longer than Ethan anticipated. He nodded, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into his pocket. But instead of responding directly, he met her gaze for a beat longer, offering a small smile that required no further explanation. Maya walked away and Ethan remained where he stood, the weight of her gratitude settling into something deeper than relief. It was a rare moment when the right decision didn't just feel justified, it felt human. The ripple effects of Ethan's choices continued to spread. Over time, other theaters under his company embraced similar transformations, extending the lessons learned at the Grand Plaza Cinema to employees across the chain. The story gained quiet notoriety within the company's community, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the possibilities of what attention, empathy, and a commitment to people could achieve when paired with decisive action. True leadership isn't built on strict adherence to policies or heartless enforcement of the bottom line. As Ethan reflected on the changes over time, he realized it was about creating a culture where employees weren't disposable, where their struggles weren't ignored, and where their contributions felt meaningful in more ways than just profit margins. Compassion had turned a moment of crisis into something far greater, a foundation for a future that Ethan hadn't dared to imagine when he first went undercover. It wasn't about perfection or instant results. It was about the power of trying. Ethan's story demonstrates that compassion isn't a weakness in leadership. It's a strength that builds loyalty and lasting success. By choosing to help Maya and Lila instead of punishing them, he turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for change. Employees felt valued, customers noticed the difference, and the theater thrived. His decision to invest in people rather than profits showed that ethical leadership wasn't just morally right. Ask yourself, how can empathy guide your decisions in the workplace? Would you choose to judge or to listen? Sometimes the simplest gesture of understanding can change everything.